Section 20 of the Athenian Empire by George William Cox. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 5, The Peloponnesian War, the Sicilian Expedition, Part 1. That the Empire of Athens depended on the maintenance of her supremacy in the Aegean Sea, and that this supremacy could not be maintained without a thorough hold on the Hellenic cities which studded its northern shores, and therefore that no efforts could be too great to reduce the towns that had revolted in that quarter, no sober-minded Athenian citizen could have doubted for a moment. It was the lesson which Pericles had preached throughout his political career, and his warnings against the folly of attempting distant conquests simply expressed his conviction that slackness in the recovery of a place like Amphipolis would be a crime or a blunder not less mischievous and ruinous. But for a long time there had been signs that for a certain class of politicians in Athens, the idea of interference in the distant island of Sicily had special attractions. In 427, 12 years had passed since the celebrated rhetorician Gorgias had headed an embassy from Leontini to ask the aid of Athens against the Syracusans, who were at open war not only with them, but with Naxos and Catani. The argument on which he chiefly laid stress was that if the Sicilian Dorians should be suffered to subdue their Ionian kinsfolk, the Spartans would not fail to receive from Sicily the succors on which the Corinthians had long been counting. The Leontine envoys found little difficulty in obtaining promises of help, but during the autumn of that year, the Athenian generals sent to their aid accomplished little. In the following summer, Messene became a subject ally of Athens, hostages being taken in 426 for its fidelity. But in spite of this caution, the generals of the next year found the place again in the hands of the Syracusans. They had been delayed on the way partly by the circumstances which led to the occupation of Pylos by Demosthenes, and partly by the frightful seditions which were at that time turning Corcyra into a shambles. Horrible as was the state of things there, and wantonly wicked as the conduct of Eurymedon, the Athenian general, may have been, the history of this desperate strife between the Corcyrian oligarchs and commons has no direct connection with that of the Athenian Empire, nor had it on public opinion in Sicily anything like the effect produced by the success of Demosthenes at Sphacteria. The conception and execution of the plan which left Sparta almost helpless brought home to the Sicilian Greeks the likelihood that their incessant quarrels and wars might leave the whole island at the mercy of a people who had shown a power of resistance and a fertility of resource far beyond any with which at the beginning of the war their enemies would have credited them. This fear was first felt by the citizens of Camarina and Gela, and probably was first expressed by the men of the weaker city. In a congress in 424 held at Gela, the Syracusan Hermocrates, forgetting that the Sicilian Dorians had seized on the beginning of the great struggle between Athens and Sparta as a convenient time for making an attack upon their Ionian neighbours, dwelt strongly on the necessity of settling their feuds in the presence of a danger which threatened all the Sicilian Greeks alike. The peace which he desired was made, but it was not likely to last longer than the general fear of Athenian ambition, a fear which was speedily dispelled by the disasters of the Boeotian campaign and the crowning catastrophe of Delion, while at the same time the suspicion was reawakened that in the city which Hermocrates represented, the Sicilian Ionians might have an enemy more dangerous than Athens. But a quarrel between Selinus and Egesta, one of the two cities of the Elymoi in Sicily, was destined to produce greater results than the appeals of the Leontini for the help of Athens. The latter had come at a moment when the intrigues of Alcibiades to secure the supremacy of Athens by means of a new Argive confederacy, and the expedition for the recovery of Amphipolis, which was begun only to be frustrated by the remissness or treachery of Perdiccas, left to the Athenians no time for thinking of interference in Sicily. The envoys of Egesta appeared in 416, when only a small portion of the Athenian people were finding occupation in the siege which preceded the butchery of the Melians. The graciousness of their reception may also have been in some measure due to the fact that they rested their claim to help not simply on the Athenian feelings of compassion, but on the more constraining grounds of expediency. They could not, as they admitted, stand alone, but they pledged their faith not merely to bring their own men into the field if the Athenians should decide on helping them, but to take on themselves the whole costs of the war. Charmed at the prospect thus opened to them, the Athenians, instead of pausing to think whether under any circumstances they would do well to interfere further in Sicily, resolved to send ambassadors to test the resources of the Egestians and their prospects of success in the war with Silenus. The Egestians turned out to be impostors, but the trick was discovered too late. The envoys, of which Nicias ought to have been but was not one, returned with glowing accounts of the wealth of Silenus, and the crew of the trireme which conveyed them were loud in their expressions of admiration at the magnificence of the hospitality which they enjoyed. But the treasures of the temples were of silver, not gold, and the ornaments which made their feasts so splendid represented the collective wealth, not of Egesta only, but of other cities from which they were borrowed, the whole being transferred secretly from house to house for each successive entertainment. A trick like this clearly points to bribery, but the bribery of a whole ship's crew is a somewhat costly business, and if these are to be acquitted, the good faith of the ambassadors is still more seriously called into question. For the present, the Athenian people were convinced that the Egestians had spoken the truth when the envoys laid before them 60 talents of uncoined silver as a month's pay in advance for a fleet of 60 vessels, and a decree was passed appointing Alcibiades, Nicias, and Lamachus commanders of an expedition charged with maintaining the cause of Egesta and with the general furtherance of Athenian interests in Sicily. Nicias had done what he could to knock the whole scheme on the head, but when the assembly met again to discuss the details of the expedition, his language lacked force because, while he suspected the ambassadors, he was afraid to reflect on the sincerity of the men who had accompanied them on their mission. The life of Nicias, born though he was to high station and great wealth, was not, indeed, particularly fortunate, but of all his misfortunes none was greater than his strange inability to discern the road which almost at any given time would have led him out of his difficulties. It was also his misfortune that his habitual hesitation, caution, or timidity deprived his language of all persuasiveness, even in cases where reserve or prudence became the highest wisdom. Most of all, it was his misfortune that he had never drawn out in his mind a definite policy founded on the real interests of his country. Had he done so, he might have told his countrymen that although in discouraging the enterprise of Demosthenes at Pylos, he was setting his face against a plan which would have had the hearty approval of Pericles, still in deprecating any further interference in Sicilian affairs, he would have had the unqualified sanction of that great statesman. As it was, he never uttered words more true than when he assured his countrymen that they owed no duties to barbarian inhabitants of a distant island, that the Spartans only nominally at peace with them would welcome the first opportunity for giving vent to their stifled wrath, that if Athens was bent on righting wrongs, her business was to redress her own, and that until Amphipolis was recovered and the Thrace-ward Chalcidians were again brought under obedience, it was madness to dispatch fleets and armies to aid the Egestians. With less prudence, unless he meant to persist in his opposition, he inveighed against the selfish ambition of men who outran their fortunes in the extravagant luxury of their private lives and in the splendor with which they competed for the prizes in the great Hellenic festivals. Expressing honestly the dread with which he saw this knot of disaffected citizens grouped together in the assembly, he besought the older men to discharge their duty by putting an effectual check on their folly, and lastly entreated the prytanies or president to disregard an irregularity which would certainly be condoned, and once more to ask the assembly whether the expedition should be undertaken at all. The latter part of the speech of Nicias had been aimed at Alcibiades, and roused his vehement indignation. Foiled in his notion of setting up an Athenian empire in the Peloponnesus, he had turned with eagerness to a scheme which seemed to promise a more tempting prize in Sicily, and therefore, making a virtue of necessity, he gloried in the acts which had called forth the censures of Nicias. He insisted that the splendour of his victories at Olympia had impressed the whole Hellenic world with a sense of the power and wealth of Athens, in which they had well nigh ceased to believe. He had even the effrontery to boast of his Peloponnesian intrigues, and to assert that although Sparta had won the stake at Mantinea, she had not yet recovered the haughty confidence of the times preceding the disasters of Sphacteria. More especially he pleaded that the Athenians had attained their empire by bestowing their help on all, whether Hellenes or barbarians who chanced to ask for it, and slackness now in aggressive movements would be virtually an abandonment of the old imperial tradition. Sicily would supply a field for such action. The refusal to occupy this field would be followed by stagnation, and stagnation would end in death. It would have been well if his hearers could have seen through the assumptions and falsehoods of this impudent harangue. The insinuation that Athens must be devoured with idleness if she would not decree the expedition to Sicily had already been met by Nicias, but unfortunately his own remissness in all that concerned Amphipolis had deprived him here of a strong vantage ground. The assertion that the Athenian empire had been acquired by indiscriminate help bestowed on every applicant was a mere lie. In the first instance it had been forced upon Athens, and the Delian confederation, which had alone made her dominion possible, had sprung up from definite needs, and was confined within fixed limits. With the protection of the Asiatic Hellenes from the Persian power the work of Athens began, and with the maintenance of their safety and welfare it ended. End of section 20. Section 21 of the Athenian Empire by George William Cox. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 5, The Peloponnesian War, the Sicilian Expedition, Part 2. The support which Alcibiades received from other orators was so great that Nicias, feeling himself virtually defeated, resorted to a device by which he hoped to disgust the people with the enterprise. Declaring plainly that he regarded the Augustan professions of wealth as a falsehood, he insisted that they must be provided with no ordinary fleets or crews, and that they must go amply provided with everything that could ensure the well-being of an army under all possible accidents of war. Far from succeeding in his purpose, Nicias united all parties by proposing a course which seemed to make failure impossible, while even the more sober-minded were led to think that what Athens undertook, with a superfluity of resources, she would assuredly be able to accomplish. When, then, one of the citizens started up and insisted that without further preface Nicias should say plainly what he wanted, the unfortunate general was caught in his own trap. Like one passing sentence, not on himself, for his personal bravery was never questioned, but on his high-spirited, although mistaken countrymen, Nicias said that he must have at least 100 triremes, and if possible more than 5,000 hoplites, with light troops in proportion. The die was cast, and the efforts of Nicias to bring about the abandonment of the enterprise had secured to Alcibiades a victory far greater than any which he could have hoped for, while it staked almost the very existence of the state on the issue of the enterprise. But in justice to Nicias, we must remember that his dissuasions were not founded on mere apprehensions of disaster. If he had made up his mind that the scheme must end in failure, we may be sure that he would have refused to command it as steadily as he had refused to take charge of the reinforcements for Pylos. His condemnation of the scheme was based on the ground that in such an enterprise victory would be not much less a calamity than defeat. The latter might cripple Athens for a time, but success would extend her empire to an unmanageable size, would involve her in a network of difficulties, and lead to schemes of aggression which would sooner or later be avenged in her downfall. The prospect for the present was singularly bright and alluring. An eager crowd of volunteers came forward, where the generals had feared that they might have to constrain men for an irksome service. The trierarchs vied with each other in the lavishness with which they provided everything necessary for the comfort of their crews, and the cheerfulness of the people was at its height when they awoke one morning to find that the figures of Hermes had, with scarcely an exception, been mutilated and defaced. These Hermae stood in the agora, before the temples, the public buildings, the private houses, and the people comforted themselves with the thought that the reverence which they paid to him enlisted the god on their side, and pledged him as the master thief to protect them against the robbers of whom he was the most adroit and subtle. The event produced a profound sensation. No part of the city was free from the profanation thus offered to the god, and therefore all Athens had forfeited its right to the goodwill of the deity. Nor was it possible to say how far his feelings might be shared by the great company of the gods. The religious fears of the Athenians had been roused, and no people on this point were ever more sensitive. The sacrilege had been committed by men belonging to an organized body, and hence the Athenians had in their minds a secret society which hated the existing constitution of their country, and which must have engaged in active conspiracy before it could venture on such outrage of law and decency. That some conspiracy existed there is not the least doubt. Whatever it was, it is equally certain that Alcibiades had nothing whatever to do with it. It is absurd to suppose that a man should set in motion schemes which would involve him in imminent danger, and that he would do this just when he was setting off on an expedition on which he had set his heart, and to which the discovery was likely to be fatal. Hence it may with equal safety be inferred that the end aimed at was the ruin of Alcibiades and the abandonment of the enterprise. The mutilation of the Hermae would appeal directly to the religious fears of Nicias, and might call forth the protests of men who were thus far afraid to break silence. As for Alcibiades, his career had raised up against him a band of bitter enemies, and there were good grounds for thinking that if he returned a conqueror from Sicily, he would return with an ascendancy so prodigious as to render the possibility of a despotism renewed in his person no mere dream. The great thing then was to prevent him from going, and in this they very nearly succeeded. But the charge brought against him had, strangely enough, nothing to do with the mutilation of the Hermae. Rewards offered for the apprehension of conspirators brought forward witnesses who accused him not of mutilating statues, but of mimicking in private houses the ceremonies of the Eleusinian mysteries. Of this there is no reason to suppose him innocent, but there is no greater reason for inferring on this account his guilt in the matter of the Hermae. The demeanour of Alcibiades in this crisis was straightforward and commendable. He insisted on being brought to trial before he sailed, asserting at the same time his innocence and professing his willingness to submit to any penalty if he should be found guilty. But his opponents saw that a large proportion of the army was on his side, and that his condemnation might send home in wrath or disgust the Argive and Mantinean allies, whom he had persuaded to join in the expedition. It was therefore decided that his trial should be postponed to some time subsequent to his recall. It was now midsummer, and the fleet was ready for sea, and never did a more magnificent force issue from Athens than when the hoplites left the city to embark on board the ships which were to bear them away to Sicily. Its splendour lay not so much in the numbers, whether of the men or of the triremes, nor was the day made memorable so much by the brilliancy of the military array, as by the high hopes, troubled by some transient misgivings, which filled the hearts of all who had accompanied their friends from the city and were now to bid them farewell. Almost the whole population of Athens had come down to the Piraeus. Foreigners were there, gazing in wonder at the sumptuousness of the armament, while fathers, brothers, wives, and children felt their bright hopes fading away as they were brought face to face with the stern realities of parting. Thus far they had buoyed themselves up with the thought that the power of Athens was fully able to accomplish her purposes. But now the length of the voyage, their scanty knowledge of the island which they were going to conquer, and the certainty that in any case many were departing who would never see their homes again, threw a dark veil over the future, and many burst into bitter weeping. The trumpets gave the signal for silence, and while some prayed to a god and father, neither local nor changeful, the voices of the heralds rose in invocation of the gods of the city. Presently the paean shout echoed over the waters, and the long line of triremes swept in file from the harbour. Even in Sparta, with its habitual wariness and secrecy, a plan so vast could not have been formed without giving rise to rumours which would reach the state against whom these preparations were being made. At Athens there could be no secrecy, but the tidings brought to Syracuse were received with an incredulity against which Hermocrates in vain raised his voice, urging them to man their triremes and wait for the Athenians on the shores of Italy, and thus probably determined Nicias, whose delight of the enterprise was notorious, to abandon it altogether. His opponent Athenagoras insisted, on the contrary, that the Athenians, noted as they were for sobriety of judgment, would never be so frantic as to leave a war unfinished in Chalcidice in order to undertake a war on a huger scale in Sicily, and that the persons to be punished were, therefore, not the Athenians, whom they would never see, but the orators, who, for their own selfish ends, sought to scare them with imaginary terrors, and to shut their eyes to more real perils at home. The speech of Athenagoras would have been followed beyond doubt by angry controversy, had not the strategoi or generals, interposing their authority, insisted that as they were responsible for the safety of the city, so they would take the measures most likely to ensure it. While with the Syracusans the coming of the enemy was a matter of doubt and controversy, tidings were brought that the Athenians had already reached Rhegion. Their progress was not flattering to their hopes. The Tarentines and Locrians would have nothing to do with them. The men of Rhegion insisted on maintaining a strict neutrality until they could learn the wishes of their fellow Italiots, and the ships sent forward before the fleet returned with the news that the wealth of Egesta was a fiction, and that its treasury contained no more than the modest sum of 30 talents. The discovery greatly disconcerted Alcibiades. To Nicias it was no disappointment, and his mind was soon made up. He proposed to act according to the letter of his instructions, and having displayed the power of Athens before the cities on the coasts of Sicily, to return home unless any fresh events should open a way for further operations. A course so honest had little attractions for Alcibiades, who urged that envoys should be sent to the Sicilian cities in the hope of detaching them from Syracuse, and to the Sicil tribes in the hope of securing their friendship as preliminaries to their attack upon Syracuse and Selinus. Taking the view of the mere general as distinguished from the statesman, Lamachus insisted that not a moment was to be lost while the impression made by their sudden arrival was still fresh. Syracuse was as yet quite unprepared for the struggle, and an immediate attack upon it would be followed by either complete victory or an important success. Of these three plans, That of Nicias was the best from the statesman's point of view. From that of the general, the counsel of Lamachus was both bold and able. That of Alcibiades was unworthy either of the soldier or the statesman. A more prudent and businesslike course than that which Nicias proposed can scarcely be imagined, and the result would have been a return home, if not after brilliant success, yet without disgrace, and without that exasperation of feeling which would have followed the execution of the plan of Lamachus. That of Alcibiades was a trimming and vacillating compromise, which showed him to be as deficient in true military genius as he was prominent for the arrogance of his demeanour. Unhappily, it was the plan which was enforced by the adhesion of Lamachus, who felt as a soldier that it was better to run the chance of victory with Alcibiades than at once to abandon it with Nicias. An attempt of Alcibiades to win the alliance of Messene was unsuccessful. Overtures not more fortunate made to the men of Catani were followed by a display of Athenian ships in the great harbour of Syracuse, but nothing was accomplished beyond a survey of the fortifications. On their return to Catani, the generals were admitted to a conference within the city, and while Alcibiades was speaking, some Athenians found their way into the town through a postern which had been imperfectly walled up, and appeared in the agora. The small minority which constituted the Syracusan party, seeing the enemy thus seemingly in possession of the place, hurried away, and in their absence the Catanians, passing a decree of alliance with the Athenians, invited them to bring thither the forces which had been left at Rhegion. The news that Camarina might be expected to join them led the generals to sail thither, but they found only that the Camarinians were resolved on maintaining their neutrality, and on their return to Catani they learnt that the Salaminian trireme had brought a summons for Alcibiades to return to Athens for his trial. End of section 21. Section 22 of the Athenian Empire by George William Cox. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 5. The Peloponnesian War, the Sicilian Expedition, Part 3. The departure of the fleet for Sicily had been followed at Athens by a religious excitement which speedily became intense, but although many were imprisoned, some put to death, and others sentenced in their absence for a share in the plot of the Hermocopidae, or mutilators of the busts of Hermes, evidence criminating Alcibiades in the affair was not forthcoming, and the charge on which he was summoned home accused him simply of mimicking the Eleusinian mysteries in his own house. But although the popular indignation against Alcibiades was thus carried to a high pitch, his enemies could obtain no order for his apprehension. It was felt that such a measure might drive away the Argive and Mantinean allies, and perhaps excite dangerous discontent among the Athenian troops themselves. The commander of the Salaminian trireme had therefore no further charge than to deliver to Alcibiades an order to return home in his own ship. Alcibiades accompanied the trireme as far as Thurii, but when the ships were to sail onwards he was nowhere to be seen, and all attempts to search for him were fruitless. Nicias and Lamachus were now joint commanders of the expedition, but the latter hesitated to place himself in opposition to a colleague whose influence with the army far exceeded his own. The fleet therefore sailed through the Messenian Strait and coasted along the northern shore of the island without achieving any material success. The first feelings of awe and depression felt by the Syracusans had now given way to something like contempt, and the discovery of this fact suggested to Nicias a device for effecting an uncontested landing in the Bay of Syracuse. A Catanian informed the Syracusans that the men of his city would set fire to the Athenian fleet if, on a given day, the Syracusans would attack their lines. The bait was eagerly seized. The whole force of the city was dispatched to Catani, but while they were on their march, the Athenian fleet had sailed round the island of Ortygia into the great harbour, and had landed its troops on the western shore near the inlet known as the Bay of Dascon. Here a strong position was speedily fortified, and a battle fought on the following day with the Syracusan army, which had returned with unabated confidence from Catani, ending in a victory of no decisive importance for the Athenians. A real defeat might have led Nicias at once to give up the enterprise, to the unspeakable benefit of Athens. His insignificant success furnished him with an excuse for spending the winter in comparative idleness, and sending to Athens for troops and munitions of war. But even now the general prospect was almost as favourable as it had been at first. Between the great harbour and the Bay of Thapsos lay the inner city on Ortygia, joined by a bridge to the mainland, and the outer city on Acradina to the north, each with its own walls. Between the two, the little harbour afforded an unwalled landing place, and there was no reason why the Athenians should not at once have drawn their lines within the circuit of the wall which, during the winter now beginning, the Syracusans threw up from the shore of the great port, taking in the precincts of Apollon Temenites. But now, as before, the golden hours were wasted. The fleet sailed to Messene, and there they had the first practical experience of the hatred of Alcibiades. His countrymen had sentenced him to death. He had sworn that they should feel that he was alive. Warned by him of the intended betrayal of the town, the Syracusan faction put the Athenian partisans to death. During the winter the envoys both of the Syracusans and the Athenians appeared at Camarina, and it is especially remarkable that the Athenian, Euphemos, invites the adhesion of the Camarinians on just those grounds which Nicias had urged as reasons for abandoning the enterprise altogether, and which must have failed to awaken the enthusiasm of the Athenian people. For the time, the Athenians were beyond all doubt smitten with the lust of conquest, and dreamt of an indefinite extension of their empire. But Euphemos nevertheless insisted that they had not come to effect any permanent settlement in Sicily, nor to make the island a part of their empire. Their objects were twofold. The one they would be glad to attain, the other must at all costs be achieved. They earnestly desired the friendship of Camarina and other Sicilian cities, but they could not afford to leave the Dorians of Sicily in a position which would enable them to give important aid to the Dorians of the Peloponnesus. The fact, however, still remained that the Athenians had no reason to fear aggression even from Syracuse, and that therefore the motives alleged by Euphemos for their presence in Sicily were not those which had really brought them. The envoys on both sides were dismissed with courtesy, but Camarina remained neutral, when the prompt action recommended by Lamachus might have secured her hearty friendship. In fact, during the winter the plan of action, such as it was that of Nicias, and it showed his incompetence as a general scarcely less than his previous career had shown his incompetence as a statesman. The fate of Athens at this time was indeed hard. Her aggressive instincts led her to put faith in the most profligate and lawless of men. The reverence which she paid to personal integrity seduced her into the not less fatal error of trusting a momentous task to a citizen whose only merit was his respectability. Meanwhile, the evil genius of Athens was busy at work elsewhere. Having received a solemn pledge for his safety, Alcibiades presented himself at Sparta, the city whose power he had hoped to destroy on the field of Mantinea. Not long after his arrival came Corinthian and Syracusan envoys to urge an open resumption of the war with Athens. The ephors were placidly contenting themselves with the expression of a hope that the Syracusans would hold out, when Alcibiades broke in upon the debate with a vehemence for which he felt that some apology was needed. With matchless effrontery he took credit to himself for exceptional moderation and sobriety, for the prudence of his public counsels, and for his real love of oligarchy, which he had made up his mind to set up at Athens on the first convenient opportunity. Of his own share in originating the Sicilian Expedition, he said not a word. But he dared to tell the Spartans that schemes which even he had not ventured to put forth before the assembly were familiar to the minds of his countrymen generally, that they contemplated the subjugation of the whole Carthaginian Empire, and intended to swamp the Peloponnesus with hordes of Iberians, and thus make themselves supreme in all Hellas. If Syracuse should fall, these visions would assuredly be realized. A Spartan force, then, should at once be sent to Syracuse. The presence of a Spartan general to organize resistance in that city was even more needful. But most needful of all was it to cripple the Athenians at home. The establishment of a permanent garrison within her borders would weight them with a burden scarcely tolerable, and at Decelea, in the lower ground between Parnes and Pentelicus, they would find a post which would give them the command of the silver mines of Laurium, while it would do the Athenians mischief far more serious than the loss of a few cartloads of precious metal. When we remember that Athens lay exposed to this deadly wound only because the flower and strength of the people had been drafted away on a distant expedition, which Alcibiades himself had planned and urged on with frantic passion, we can scarcely avoid the conclusion that whatever may have been his wrongs, treachery more dastardly has rarely been found in the annals of mankind. But what were his wrongs? His life at Athens had been one of enormous license, yet even thus he had been enabled to repel an accusation for which the evidence of facts was not forthcoming. His recall had nothing to do with the mutilation of the Hermae. He had not even to answer any charge of political conspiracy. So great was the charm of his manner, and such were his powers of persuasion, that had he chosen, on first being charged with complicity in the schemes of unknown conspirators, to make a clean breast of it, and while asserting his ignorance of those plots, to express his regret for acts of profanity and irreverence which were never designed to be more than a private jest, and which ought not therefore to be regarded as an offence against the Athenian people or the public gods. The minor offence would in all likelihood have been condoned, and promising greater care for the time to come, he would have departed for Sicily free from all accusations and from all suspicion. But the armour of traitors is seldom invulnerable, and Alcibiades ensured his death wound when he asserted that no man was bound to look upon a state as his country any longer than he received from that state the treatment which he regarded as his due. Such a doctrine could be tolerated nowhere, least of all perhaps by the state which had cut short the career of Pausanias, and in due time it was remembered. But for the present his work was done. It was decreed that a Spartan army should seize on Decelea, and that Gylippus should at once be sent to take the command at Syracuse, 414. The choice was fully justified by the event. While Alcibiades was thus rekindling the war in the Peloponnesus, the trireme sent by Nicias for more men and money reached Athens. Both were granted without a word to express the disappointment which the Athenians must have felt, and the strength of the state was more dangerously committed to an expedition which it would have been infinitely better if they had from the outset starved. End of section 22. Section 23 of the Athenian Empire by George William Cox. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 5, The Peloponnesian War, the Sicilian Expedition, Part 4. For the present, Nicias, unenterprising and sluggish as he was, had the vast advantage of possessing a first-rate general in his remaining colleague Lamachus, and the change which comes over the conduct of the siege immediately after the death of Lamachus justifies us in attributing to him such success as the besiegers had thus far achieved. The occupation of the tableland of Epipolae by the Athenians neutralized the effect of the wall built by the Syracusans enclosing the ground to the east of the temple of Apollon Temenites. The building of a fort on Labdalon was followed immediately by the erection of another work with a rapidity which amazed their enemies. This strongly fortified enclosure was to serve as a stronghold for the army, and as a centre and starting point for the blockading walls, which were to run thence eastward to Trogilas and westward to the great harbour. The first counterwork of the Syracusans, which, starting probably from Temenites and extending to the cliffs of Epipolae, cut the intended southern wall of the besiegers, was carried by storm. The wall itself was destroyed, and the materials were used by the Athenians in their work of circumvallation. The Athenian generals now resolved that the Syracusans should not have the opportunity of throwing out fresh counterworks, running like the last to the cliffs of Epipolae. The cliffs were themselves fortified, and the Athenians had thus an immense advantage in their task of carrying their southward wall to the great harbour. Meanwhile, the Syracusans were busied on a second counterwork, carried from the new wall of the city across the low and marshy ground stretching to the banks of the Anapus. The Athenians thus found themselves opposed by a fresh obstacle in their progress to the sea, and Lamachus determined to make himself master of this stockade and of the trench by which it was defended. The fleet was ordered to sail round from Thapsas into the great harbour, and an attack on the counterwork at daybreak was rewarded by the capture of almost the whole of it. The rest was taken later on in the day, but a picked body of Athenian hoplites, having hurried to the bridge across the Anapus in order to cut off some of the Syracusan fugitives, was attacked by a body of the enemy's horse and thrown into disorder. Seeing their danger, Lamachus hurried to their aid, and crossing a trench, was for a moment separated from his followers. In an instant he was struck down and killed. But the Syracusans gained no immediate advantage from his death, and the doom of Syracuse seemed to be sealed when the whole army retreated within the city, while the magnificent Athenian fleet, with all its splendid appointments, was seen sweeping round into the harbour which it was destined never to leave. Some weeks were yet to pass before Gylippus the Spartan could attempt to enter Syracuse, and the one thing of vital moment was that the city should be completely invested before that attempt should be made. A single wall carried from the great harbour to the central fort, and thence to the sea at the northern extremity of Acradina, would have amply sufficed for this purpose. But Lamachus was no longer at hand to urge the necessity of speed, and Nicias wasted time in building the southward wall double from the first, while much of the ground which should have been guarded by the northeastern wall was left open. But although the Syracusans were thus able still to bring in supplies by the road which passed under the rock of Eurylas, their prospects were gloomy enough. They were beginning to feel the miseries of a state of siege, and their irritation was vented upon their generals. Hermocrates and his colleagues were deprived of their command, and the elation and consequent supineness of Nicias were increased when he learnt from the Philo-Athenian party within the city that the Syracusans were on the eve of surrender. The prospect of this unconditional submission probably made him turn a deaf ear to the proposals which were actually made to him for a settlement of the quarrel. The Athenians seemed indeed to be floating on the full tide of good fortune. Tyrrhenian ships were hastening to join their fleet, and Sicil tribes, which had thus far held aloof, were pressing forward to their aid. Meanwhile Gylippus, sorely discouraged by reports which purposely exaggerated the difficulties of the Syracusans, was working his way to Sicily. Far from giving him the help which he expected, the men of Thurii sent to inform Nicias that a Spartan general was approaching, more in the guise of a pirate or privateer than as the leader of a force which should command respect. The contempt implied in the phrase soothed the vanity of Nicias, who showed his sense of his own superiority by failing to send, until it was too late, so much as a single ship to prevent his landing in Sicily. But even when Gylippus had begun his land march, Nicias had only to block the roads by which he had himself seized Epipolae, and Gylippus must have fallen back to devise some other means for succouring Syracuse. Even in this he failed, and by a strange irony of fate, the Syracusans were discussing definitely in their public assembly the terms for a pacification, when with a single ship the Corinthian Gongalas made his way to the city and told them that the aid of which they had despaired was almost at their doors. At once all thoughts of submission were cast to the winds, and they made ready to march out with all their forces to bring Gylippus into the town. To this Nicias interposed no hindrance. His workmen were busy on the few furlongs which remained unfinished at the end of the southern wall, where for the present there was no danger whatever, when Gylippus entered Syracuse almost as a conqueror. The Athenians were at once made to feel that the parts of the actors had been changed. The Spartan general offered them a truce for 5 days if they would spend this time in leaving not merely Syracuse but Sicily. The next day was marked by the loss of the fortress of Labdalon. At the same time, a third Syracusan counterwork was steadily advancing, which would cut the northern blockading wall at a point about 500 yards to the east of the central fort, and the passing of this spot would render the whole work spent on the blockading walls mere labour lost. So far as Nicias could judge, the contest must be decided in the great harbour, and he resolved, while there was yet time, to fortify the promontory of Plemmyrion, which with Ortygia, from which it is 1 mile distant, formed the entrance to the port. As a post commanding the access to the harbour, it had great advantages, but it had no water, and the Syracusan horsemen harassed or destroyed the foraging parties, which were compelled to seek supplies from long distances. More fatal than all was the admission implied by this change of position that the Athenians were rather defending themselves than attacking. Henceforth their seeming victories were to do them no good. Their slightest failures or blunders were to do them infinite harm. The Syracusans were successful in carrying their third counterwork across the enemy's lines, and all hope of blockading Syracuse except by storming this counterwall faded finally away. But Nicias still had it in his power to guard the entrances to the slopes of Epipolae, and thus keep the ground open for the work which the new force from Athens must inevitably have to do. Again the opportunity was allowed to slip, and the Syracusans were suffered to raise the further works without which Gylippus saw that the city could not be safe, if an army of sufficient strength should occupy the heights under Eurylas. These works consisted of a strong fort, seemingly not far from Labdalon, joined with the third counterwork by a single wall. On the north side of this long wall were built 3 forts to serve as guard posts in the event of an attack on the long wall. So passed away the precious days, while the idleness of Nicias added to the colossal burden under which even the genius of Demosthenes broke down. While Gylippus was thus bestirring himself on behalf of Syracuse, a messenger was bearing to Athens a letter in which Nicias professed to give a plain, unvarnished report of all that had thus far befallen the fleet and army. Strict truth would have called upon him to confess that the first 3 months of his time in Sicily had been wholly wasted, that by his inaction during the first winter he had allowed the Syracusans to build a new city wall, thus rendering necessary an enormous extension of the besieging lines, that he had failed to turn to account the success of Lamachus in the destruction of the second Syracusan counterwork, that he had not prevented the entry of Gylippus into Syracuse with a formidable reinforcement, that he had made no effort to hinder the construction of the final works and forts of the enemy, which rendered the successful prosecution of the siege an almost hopeless task, that having brought with him a fleet of unparalleled efficiency, he had dispirited the crews either by inactivity or by employing them on useless errands, and that his ships, from being constantly in the water, were fast becoming unseaworthy. Far from making these admissions, Nicias, in the only 2 passages in his letter in which he blames anyone, blames not himself but the men under his command and the Athenians who had sent him as their commander. He told them in substance that at first they had been uniformly victorious, until Gylippus came with an army from Peloponnesus, but he never told them that common care would have made his entrance impossible. He told them that not merely the splendid appearance, but the usefulness of their ships was wretchedly impaired, forgetting that only through his own resistance to the counsels of Lamachus they had failed to do and to finish their work long ago. He told them that either the present army must be withdrawn, or another army of equal strength sent to reinforce it, adding the expression of his own wish to be relieved from his command, for which he was incapacitated by a painful internal disease. He had always been incapacitated for it, but whether, when this ominous letter was read in the assembly, there were any who had the wisdom to see and the courage to denounce the monstrous misconduct of the expedition, we are not told. His resignation was not received, but 2 of his officers, Menandrus and Euthydemus, were appointed his colleagues until the generals should arrive with the reinforcements from Athens. The disaster of Sphacteria had convinced the Spartans that they and their allies were under divine displeasure for the way in which they had brought about the war, and they acknowledged that in the crisis which preceded the outbreak of the struggle, the Athenians were in the right and themselves wholly in the wrong. Hence they were especially anxious that the blame of renewing the strife should attach distinctly to the Athenians, and the landing of some Athenian ships with their crews at this time to ravage the territories of Epidaurus and some other cities seemed to furnish the overt breach of the peace which they wanted. Early in the spring of 413, therefore, a Spartan army marching to Decalia not merely renewed a war which had been only nominally interrupted, but seemingly without opposition, built the fortress which gave its name to the 10 years' struggle which followed its erection. End of section 23. Section 24 of the Athenian Empire by George William Cox. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 5, The Peloponnesian War, the Sicilian Expedition, Part 5. Meanwhile, at Syracuse, Gylippus was urging the people to attack the Athenians on their own element. His great object was to obtain possession of the entrance to the great harbour, and he therefore arranged a simultaneous attack on the Athenian fleet and the naval station at Plemmyrion by 2 divisions of the Syracusan fleet, while his land forces should attack the forts. Both in the harbour and at the naval station the Syracusans were at first victorious, but when the Athenians at last gained sufficient room for the manoeuvre in which they were unrivalled, they speedily sunk 11 ships of the enemy at the cost of 3 of their own. The victory, however, came too late to do them any good. Plemmyrion was already lost. With astonishing want of caution, the garrisons of the 3 forts had gone down to the beach to view the naval conflicts in which they could be of no use, and in their absence Gylippus fell on the forts with overwhelming force, and thus became master not only of the entrance to the harbour, but of the large quantities of corn and money which had been placed there for safety, together with 3 triremes which had been hauled up for repairs, and the sails and tackle of nearly 40 ships. Henceforth Athenian convoys could be introduced into the harbour only after a fight. Blow after blow now fell on the besieging force. Their treasure ships were intercepted, the timber stored for shipbuilding was set on fire, and it was unfortunate for Athens that the Syracusans did not succeed in their larger scheme for the destruction of the Athenian fleet before any reinforcements should reach them. The ruin of the navy of Nicias would have furnished to Demosthenes sufficient excuse for taking off the army and forthwith returning home. This attack was delayed by a disaster which befell a body of allies who on their way to Syracuse were, at the request of Nicias, cut off by some of the Sicel tribes. Had Nicias taken this step while Gylippus was on his march, the issue of the siege might have been different. As it was, 800 of these allies were slain, but the remaining 1,500 reached the city. Nor was this the only accession of strength on the Syracusan side. Acragas, Agrigentum, alone of all the Sicilian cities, insisted on remaining neutral. But apart from mere additions to their numbers, the Syracusans were fast acquiring that power of making the best of circumstances to which the Athenians owed the rapid growth of their empire. They were well aware that for Athenian fleets ample sea room was indispensable, and as they saw the Athenian ships cooped up at one end of their harbour, they drew the conclusion that the bulk and awkwardness of their own vessels would tell in their favour only so long as the Athenians were unable to resort to their peculiar tactics. A simultaneous attack by land and sea produced on the first day no decisive results. 2 days later things were following much the same course, when a Corinthian suggested that the Syracusan crews should take their midday meal on the shore and then immediately renew the fight. Seeing their enemy retreat at noon, the Athenians thought that their work for the day was done. They were soon undeceived, and few of them had eaten anything when they saw the Syracusan fleet again advancing in order of battle. Even thus, in spite of the disorder arising from the hasty surprise, the Athenians had lost nothing until hunger compelled them to bring the matter to an issue. The result was precisely what the Syracusans had expected. The heavily weighted bows of their ships crushed the slender prows of the Athenian triremes as these advanced rapidly to the encounter. 3 Syracusan ships were lost, but 7 Athenian vessels had been sunk, and many more disabled, when 73 triremes, bringing with them 5,000 hoplites with light troops in proportion, swept into the great harbour. The first feeling of the Syracusans at this fresh display of the resources of Athens, at a time when her enemies were establishing a permanent garrison at Decalia, was one of consternation. But Demosthenes, who commanded this reinforcement, saw at a glance that the temporary advantage gained by his coming must go for nothing unless some decisive success should justify the continuance of the siege. If the Syracusan cross wall could be taken, and the guards on the 3 forts fronting it be disarmed or slain, there might be some hope of storming their counter wall and so of effectually investing Syracuse. Attacks by day could, however, have little chance of success, and Demosthenes resolved on a night assault. A moonlit night was chosen for the purpose. His men, in spite of all previous sufferings, were full of hope and even of confidence. They were now acting under a general whose sagacity and counsel and energy in the field had won him the highest reputation, and they carried with them everything which might be reasonably expected to ensure their success. At first all went well. Not only did the Athenians make their way along Eurylos, but the cross wall itself was taken before any alarm could be given. The Athenian generals now led on a large proportion of their forces to the counter wall, while others began to demolish the cross wall, and the determined energy of their assault drove back Gylippus, who now came up with all the forces at his command. In fact, their work was already done if they could only maintain their position, and had they set out an hour or 2 before dawn instead of an hour or 2 before midnight, they would in all likelihood have succeeded in doing so. They had turned the Syracusan lines, and the daylight would now be rather to their advantage than to that of their enemy. But Demosthenes was anxious to push the Syracusans at once as far back as possible, and success with Greek troops generally led to neglect of discipline. The Athenians in front were already in some disorder, when they were thrown into confusion by the sudden charge of some heavy Boeotian hoplites who had been recently brought to Sicily. From this moment the battle became a wild jumble. As the disorder increased, the Athenians were no longer able to see in what direction their movements should be made, nor to distinguish in the uproar the words of command. The watchword repeatedly asked for and given became known to the enemy. The discovery was fatal, and the presence of Dorians in the Athenian army completed the catastrophe. The war cry of the Argives and their other Dorian allies could not be distinguished from the Syracusans, and the Athenians, dismayed already, were bewildered by the suspicion that the enemy was in their rear, was among them, was everywhere. The defeat had become utter rout. In their efforts to reach their lines on the Anapus, hundreds were pushed over the precipices which bounded the slopes, and were either sorely maimed or killed. Others belonging to the reinforcements of Demosthenes, who knew nothing of the nature of the ground, strayed away into the country, where they were found by the Syracusan horsemen and slain. The enterprise of Demosthenes had failed, and he now saw that, do what they would, the siege must be abandoned or end in their ruin. In such circumstances he was not a man likely to hesitate, and he discharged the duty which he owed as much to Athens as to himself with a manly frankness, sullied by no mean or selfish feelings. For the present, the fleet which he had brought made them once more masters of the sea, and he candidly assured Nicias that his business was to remove the army at once while the path lay open. The reply of Nicias betrays either a startling infatuation or a not less startling mental depravity, and we have to remember that it is preserved to us by an historian who reviews his career with singular indulgence, and who cherished his memory with affectionate but melancholy veneration. He chose to speak of the Philo-Athenian party as still strong in Syracuse, but his resolution was taken on other grounds. The Athenians, he asserted, were a people under the dominion of loud-voiced demagogues, and of the men who were now crying out under the hardships of the siege, the greater number would, if they should again take their seats in the assembly, join eagerly in charging their generals with treachery or corruption. Nothing, therefore, should induce him to consent to their retreat before he received from Athens positive orders commanding his return. In truth, he was afraid to go home, and was a coward where Demosthenes, in spite of his failures, was honest, straightforward, and brave. He was even ungenerous as well as cowardly. He had no right to slander soldiers who had done their duty admirably. Least of all was he justified in ascribing an exacting severity to a people whose sin it had been to place unbounded confidence in his mere respectability. In vain Demosthenes again insisted that the siege must be given up, and that even if they were to await instructions from Athens, they were bound in the meantime to remove their fleet to Catane or Naxos. So firm was the opposition of Nicias that Demosthenes began to think that he had some private grounds for his resistance which time in the end would justify. He had none, and when Gylippus returned to Syracuse with large reinforcements, Nicias admitted that retreat was inevitable, and requested only that the order should be privately circulated, not formally decreed in a council of war. This consent, even now reluctantly extorted, came to Demosthenes as a reprieve for which he had almost ceased to hope, and the preparations for departure were far advanced when an eclipse of the moon filled Nicias with an agony of religious terror. The prophets must be consulted, and their decision followed. According to Thucydides, they declared that no movement must be made for 27 days. Diodorus tells us that they required no more than the usual delay of 3 days, and even Plutarch affirms that in insisting on the longer time, Nicias went altogether beyond their demands. If this story be true, his infatuation assumes a blacker character. He had sealed the doom of the fleet and the army, for long before the 27 days had passed away, this once magnificent armament had been utterly destroyed. Through Syracuse the tidings flew like fire that the Athenians, having resolved on retreat, had been detained by the eclipse. The first decision was an admission of defeat and hopelessness. The second gave them ample time for securing their prey. An assault by the Syracusan fleet, when all was ready, ended in the destruction of the squadron commanded by Eurymedon. On land, the Athenians had won some advantages over the Syracusans, and the rules of Greek warfare compelled them to treat this check as a victory, but they probably felt that the setting up of their trophy was but as the last flash of the sinking sun, which gives a more ghastly hue to the pitch-black storm clouds around him. They had undergone a ruinous defeat by sea, and the hope that the new triremes of Demosthenes would restore the balance had failed them altogether. For the Syracusans, the result of the battle had changed the whole character of the struggle. A little while ago they had been fighting in the mere hope of compelling the enemy to abandon the siege. The prospect was now open to them of sweeping away the Athenian empire. With the intoxication of men who from mountain summits seem to look down on a world beneath them, they abandoned themselves to the conviction that henceforth they must fill a foremost place in the history of Hellas. They were now leaders, along with the Spartans, Corinthians, Arcadians, and Boeotians, against the relics of the most splendid and efficient armament which had ever left the harbours of Athens. The epical conception which had led Thucydides to ascribe to the Athenians before the massacre of Melas language which belies their general reputation, now leads him to enumerate with a solemnity full of pathos the tribes which were to face each other in the last awful struggle. Here, as at Marathon, the Plataeans were present in the hope, perhaps, of avenging themselves on the Boeotian allies of Syracuse, but prompted still more by a devotion to Athens which had never wavered. Here Aegina was represented, not by the descendants of those who had conquered at Salamis, but by the Athenian citizens who had been thrust into their place. Here, with the Dorian allies of Athens, were Messenians from Pylos and Naupactus, and Acarnanians, who were now to follow to their death the standard of their favourite general. On the side of the Syracusans were enrolled the Camarinians, for whose friendship the Athenian Euphemos had bidden largely, and the men of Selinus, who were to play their part in the closing scenes of the stupendous drama which had grown out of their petty quarrel with the barbarians of Egesta. In the enthusiasm excited by their victory, the Syracusans resolved that the whole Athenian armament should be destroyed like vermin in a snare. Triremes, trading ships, and vessels of all kinds were anchored together lengthwise across the whole mouth of the harbour from Plemmyrion to Ortygia, and strongly lashed together with ropes and chains. This was all that Nicias had gained by fostering silly scruples for which the men to whom Athens owed their greatness would have felt an infinite contempt. And fierce indeed must have been the indignation of Demosthenes when he saw the supreme result of the besotted folly of his colleague. Their very food was running short, for before the eclipse an order had been sent to Catani countermanding all fresh supplies. Regret and censure were, however, alike vain. The lines along Epipolae must be abandoned, and everything staked on a last effort to break the barrier which now lay between them and safety. If this was to fail, the ships were to be burnt, and the army was to retreat by land. So far as it regarded the lines on Epipolae, this decision seems to have been an error of judgment, not on the part of Nicias, for he had no judgment to exercise, but of the firm and sagacious Demosthenes. Past experience had taught him that in countering the solid prows of the enemy's ships in a cramped space, they were setting themselves the task of cutting wood with a razor. But the lines on Epipolae gave them free access to the country beyond, and the power of effecting a deliberate and orderly retreat. A few only of the 27 days had passed when Nicias told the Athenians that all had been done which could be done to ensure success in the coming struggle. Grappling irons were to fall on the enemy's prows and keep the ships locked in a fatal embrace until the combatants on one side or the other should be swept into the sea. In short, a hard necessity compelled them to make the fight as much as possible a land battle on the water, and he besought the Athenians to show that in spite of bodily weakness and unparalleled misfortunes, Athenian skill could get the better of brute force rendered still more brutal by success. He told them plainly that they saw before them all the fleet and all the army of Athens, and that if they should now fail, her powers of resistance were gone. A speech more disgraceful to himself and less likely to encourage his men has seldom been uttered by any leader. It was his fault that Syracuse had not been taken a year ago. It was his fault that everything had gone wrong since the death of Lamachus. It was his fault that Gylippus had entered the city. It was his fault that they had not retreated when retreat was first urged by Demosthenes, and it was his fault that they had not left the harbor before the barrier of ships had been stretched across its mouth. Yet this was the man who could beseech his soldiers to remember that on the issue of this fight depended the great name of Athens and the freedom which had rendered her illustrious. End of section 24. Section 25 of the Athenian Empire by George William Cox. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 5. The Peloponnesian War, the Sicilian Expedition, Part 6. The time for the great experiment had come, and the men were all on board when Nicias, in his agony, made one more effort to rouse them, not to greater courage, for this had never failed, but to greater confidence. He cared nothing whether he repeated himself or dwelt on topics which might be thought weak or stale. They were, in fact, neither the one nor the other, and they had furnished the substance of the great funeral oration of Pericles. But it may be doubted whether he was acting judiciously in drawing to this extreme tension, at a time when steadiness of eye and hand were most of all needed, the nerves of a people so highly sensitive as the Athenians. At length the signal was given, but in spite of the rapidity of their movements and the strength of their assault, the Athenians had not succeeded in breaking the chains which bound the ships at the harbor's mouth, when the Syracusan fleet, starting from all points, attacked them in the rear. The battle was soon broken into groups, while within their lines the Athenian army, advancing to the water's edge, surveyed with alternations of passionate hope and fear the fortunes of a fight on which the lives of all depended. All, however, were not looking in the same direction, and thus there might be seen in the Athenian camp some who, in the intensity of feverish suspense, were keeping time with their bodies to the swayings of the battle, others who were abandoning themselves to a paroxysm of agony on witnessing some disaster, others carried away by an unreasonable hope on seeing their own men drive back the enemy. At last brute force prevailed. The Athenians were pushed further and further back till their whole fleet was driven ashore. Amidst the piercing shrieks and bitter weeping of the troops, who hastened to give such help as they could, the crews of the shattered ships were landed, while some hurried to the defense of their walls, and others bethought themselves of providing only for their own safety. The sun sank upon a scene of absolute despair in the Athenian encampment, and of fierce and boundless exultation within the walls of Syracuse. Demosthenes was still anxious that one more effort should be made to break the barrier at the mouth of the harbor, but the men would not stir. The generals therefore determined to retreat by land, and if the retreat had been begun at once, the whole of this still mighty armament might have been saved. The roads were still unguarded, and the whole city was so given up to a frenzy of delight that Hermocrates abandoned as hopeless the idea of inducing them to start at once and break up the ground on the probable line of march. But if he could not do this, he might try the effective stratagem to detain the Athenians as victims for the slaughter. And with Nicias, who was to be their evil genius to the end, his trick succeeded. Some Syracusan horsemen, professing to belong to the Athenian party, went down to the Athenian lines with the tidings that the roads were already blocked, and suggested that a careful and deliberate retreat on the following day would be better than a hasty departure during the night. Having remained over the first night, they thought it best to tarry yet another day. But early in the morning, while within the Athenian lines, the flames which rose from burning ships showed that the naval war was already ended, the Syracusan troops had set out into the country to break up or to guard carefully the roads, the forts, and the passes in the hills. With the morning of the second day after the battle, the retreat, which was to end in ruin, began with unspeakable agony. The cup of bitterness was indeed filled to the brim and running over. They had looked their last on the rock and shrine of the Virgin Goddess, with the expectation that they were going to make Athens the center and head of a pan-Hellenic empire. They were now marching ignominiously after irretrievable defeat, perhaps to slavery or to death. But although they could take their food, its weight would now be no oppressive burden. They could not take their sick. Hundreds were pining away with the wasting marsh fever. Hundreds were smitten down with wounds. All these must now be left, and left not as in the less savage warfare of our own times, with the confidence that they would be treated with some humanity, but to the certainty of servitude, torture, or death. As the terrible realities of departure broke upon them, the whole camp became a scene of unutterable woe. Brothers and sons were here to be forsaken, whom parents and kinsmen had accompanied with affectionate pride from the gates of Athens to the triremes at Piraeus. Comrades in the same tent were now to be separated, happy if, after a brief pang here, they should be reunited in the world unseen. In the agony of the moment, the fever-stricken sufferers clung to their companions as these set out on their miserable march, and mangled wretches crawled feebly on, entreating to be taken with them, until strength failed and they sank down by the way. In this desperate crisis, Nicias did his best to cheer and encourage the men whom his own egregious carelessness had brought into their present unparalleled difficulties. His words were chiefly a comment on the homely saying that the lane must be long which has no turning, and that the evils which they might still have to suffer must in some degree be lightened by the consciousness that they were shared alike by all. Suffering from a painful malady, accustomed during his life to the ease of a wealthy Athenian, and more than this, scrupulously exact in his religious worship and blameless in his private life, he had now to bear up under the same toils and privations with themselves. This is not the language of a man who dreads the physical dangers of war, but it is the language of one who, even in the direst extremity, cannot be brought to see that the misery which he is striving to alleviate is the result strictly of his own folly in wasting a series of golden opportunities. The horrors of the march, for which they had chosen the road to Catani, may be faintly imagined from the fact that in spite of fearful exertion, with little food, and almost without water and without sleep, they accomplished in 5 days a distance which, if unhindered, they could have traversed easily in 2 hours. Convinced now that the northward journey was impracticable, they set forth at dead of night on the Helorine road leading to the southern coast. A panic separated the division of Nicias from that of Demosthenes, who, being in the rear, had to think more of keeping his men in order of battle than of getting over the ground. Thus constrained to mass his troops, he found himself presently hemmed in between walls in an olive garden, with a roadway on either side, where his men could be shot down by an enemy who was himself exposed to no danger. For hours the fearful carnage went on, until at length the Syracusans invited the surrender of Demosthenes and his troops, under a covenant which included the general not less than his men, and by which the captors pledged themselves that none should be put to death either by violence or by bonds or by lack of the necessaries of life. The summons was obeyed, and 4 shields held upwards were filled with the money still possessed by the troops of Demosthenes, who were now led away to Syracuse. Nicias, 5 miles further to the south, had crossed the Erineas, when early on the following day the Syracusan messengers informed him of the surrender of Demosthenes, and summoned him to follow his example. The counter-proposal of Nicias, that in exchange for the men under his command Athens should pay to the Syracusans the whole cost of the war, would have filled their treasury with money sorely needed. But the delight of trampling a fallen enemy underfoot was more enticing. The terms were rejected, and all day long the harassing warfare was carried on. At night the Athenians made an attempt to escape under cover of darkness, but the war shout which instantly rose from the Syracusan camp showed that they were discovered, and with a feeling of blank dismay they remained where they were. On the following morning they reached the little stream of the Asinaros. The sight of the sparkling water banished all thoughts of order and discipline, all prudence and caution. Instead of turning round to the enemy and so covering the passage of those who had to cross first, each man sought only to plunge into the water himself, to quench his thirst, and to gain the other side. In an instant all was hopeless tumult, and the stream, fouled by the trampling of thousands, was soon reddened with their blood. Still the Peloponnesians mercilessly drove the masses before them upon the crowds already struggling in the water, and still the men drank on, almost in the agonies of death. To put an end to the slaughter, which had become mere butchery, Nicias surrendered himself to Gylippus personally, in the hope that the Spartans might remember the enormous benefits which in times past Sparta had received from him. The number of prisoners finally got together was not great. The larger number were hidden away by private men, and the state was thus defrauded of the wealth which an acceptance of the offer of Nicias would have ensured to it. 40,000 men had left the Athenian lines on the great harbour. A week later, 7,000 marched as prisoners into Syracuse. What became of the sick and wounded in the camp we are not told. We can scarcely doubt that all were murdered, and murder was mercy in comparison with the treatment of the 7,000 who were penned like cattle in the stone quarries of Epipolae. The Syracusans had promised to Demosthenes that no man belonging to his division should suffer a violent death, or die from bonds or from lack of necessary food. But they ensured the deaths of hundreds and of thousands as certainly as Suraj-ud-Dowlah murdered the victims of the Black Hole of Calcutta. The Athenian generals were happily spared the sight of these prolonged and excruciating tortures. Both were put to death, and unless the terms of the convention were to be kept, Demosthenes could of course expect no mercy. Next to Pericles and to Phormyon, there was no leader to whom Athens in this great struggle owed so much, and none, therefore, whom the Spartans and their allies regarded with more virulent hatred. In flagrant violation of a distinct compact, the victor of Sphacteria was murdered. He died as he had lived, without a stain on his military reputation, the victim of the superstition and respectability of his colleague. So ended an expedition which changed the current of Athenian history, and therefore, in a greater or less degree, of the history of the world. In the Athenian people, such a project as the conquest of Sicily was a political error of the gravest kind. They had been warned against all such undertakings by the most clear-sighted of their statesmen. They had been enticed into the scheme by Alcibiades, one of the most insolent and lawless men with which any country ever was cursed. They had allowed their plans to be enormously extended by a general who wisely advised them not to go to Sicily, and who did them a deadly mischief by consenting to go against his will. They had hazarded on this distant venture an amount of strength which was imperiously needed for the protection of Athens and the recovery of Amphipolis. And instead of a starvation, which, as things turned out, would have been wise, they fed the expedition with bounties so lavish that failure became ruin. The power of trampling on Sicily, as Gylippus and his allies trampled on the defeated armament, would have done no good to Athens or to the world. But if the isolating policy which seeks to maintain an infinite number of autonomous units, be in itself an evil, then it is unfortunate that the victory of Gylippus ensured the predominance of this policy. The empire of Athens, if it could have been maintained, might have prevented the wars of many generations, and might have kept within narrower bounds the empire of Rome itself. To a vast extent she could offer to her allies or her subjects common interests and common ends. Sparta could offer none. But the system of Sparta fell in with the instincts in the Hellenic mind, which may have been weakened but was never eradicated, and against this instinct the wisdom and prudence of Athenian statesmen strove in vain. End of section 25.